It was a Sunday afternoon like any other. My name is Pierre, and I was sitting quietly in my apartment, enjoying the tranquility of the weekend. The Paris sun filtered gently through the lace curtains, creating a peaceful atmosphere in our living room. My wife, Sophie, had gone out to do some shopping, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a good book. Suddenly, the calm was shattered by loud knocks at the door. The noise echoed throughout the apartment, startling me. I put my book down on the coffee table, intrigued and slightly worried. Who could knock like that on a Sunday afternoon? I rose slowly from the sofa, adjusting my crumpled t-shirt. The knocking redoubled in intensity as I approached the door. "I'm coming, I'm coming," I shouted, hoping to calm the impatience of my unexpected visitor. When I finally opened the door, I froze in place. Before me stood Madame Dubois, my mother-in-law, her face contorted by an anger I'd never seen in her before. Her eyes, usually soft blue, flashed with lightning. Her grey hair, usually neatly combed, was a mess, as if she'd run all the way here. "Madame Dubois," I began, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you today. Is everything all right?" But before I could finish my sentence, she abruptly pushed me aside and entered the apartment. Her usual lavender scent was replaced by a pungent odor of sweat and rage. "Shut up, Pierre," she spat, her eyes quickly roaming the apartment as if searching for something. "You have nothing to say. You're a disgrace, a real disgrace to this family." I was speechless, unable to comprehend what was happening. Madame Dubois had always been a reserved, sometimes cold woman, but I'd never seen her in such a state of fury. But what's going on?" stammered I, closing the door behind her. "What have I done?" She turned back to me, her face inches from mine. I could see every angry wrinkle, every throbbing vein on her forehead. "What you've done," she repeated, her voice rising in pitch. "You dare to ask what you've done? You're nothing but a parasite, Pierre, a good-for-nothing who takes advantage of my daughter and our family." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but she wouldn't let me get a word in. "Look around you," she yelled, gesturing wildly toward the living room. "All this luxury, this apartment. And you, what do you bring? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." I felt my heart quicken, a mixture of confusion and anger rising within me. How could she say such a thing? She knew nothing about our situation, our arrangements. "Mrs. Dubois, please calm down," I tried, trying to keep my voice composed. "I don't understand why you're saying all this. Sophie and I..." "Don't talk about my daughter," she interrupted. "You don't deserve her. You don't deserve to be part of this family." She continued pacing the living room, touching the furniture, looking at objects as if seeing them for the first time. Her gaze came to rest on a photo of Sophie and me from our wedding day. She took it in her trembling hands. "I should have opposed it," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "I should have prevented this marriage." I felt a lump form in my throat. How had it come to this? What could have triggered such a reaction? "Mrs. Dubois," I said gently, "I don't know what's making you think all this, but I assure you you're wrong. Sophie and I are happy together. I love her and I do everything I can to..." "Enough," she cried, abruptly putting the picture down again. "I don't want to hear any more of your lies. You're a fraud, Pierre. A man who hides behind his wife, who lets her pay for everything, do everything. You think I don't know that she pays for this apartment? That it's thanks to her work that you live like this?" I remained silent, dumbfounded by her accusations. If only she knew the truth. "I came here for a reason, Pierre," she continued, her voice suddenly calmer, but still menacing. "I want you to leave. Now. This apartment belongs to our family, not to you. You don't belong here anymore." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Did she want to kick me out? Out of my own apartment? "You can't do that," I said, finally finding my voice again. "This apartment is as much mine as Sophie's. You have no right to." "I have every right," she screamed again. "I'm Sophie's mother, and I won't let a good-for-nothing like you ruin her life. Get your things and get out of here." I stood motionless, unable to move, unable to think clearly. How had this quiet day turned out this way? Where was Sophie? What would she say when she came home and discovered this surreal scene? Madame Dubois stared at me, waiting for me to react, to obey her command. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. This apartment was my home, our home. And there was so much she didn't know. Silence settled in, heavy, suffocating. We stared at each other, she furious, I lost. And in this moment of extreme tension, I heard the sound of a key in the lock. Sophie was coming home. The door opened and Sophie entered, her arms full of shopping bags. Her face lit up with a smile that froze instantly when she spotted her mother and me, face to face in the living room, the atmosphere electric. "Mom! Pierre! What's going on?" she asked, slowly placing her bags on the floor. Madame Dubois turned to her daughter, her face changing from anger to false compassion in an instant. "Oh, my darling," she said in a sweet voice that made me shiver. "I came as soon as I heard. How could you keep this from us for so long?" Sophie looked at us alternately, confusion and concern mixing on her face. "Hide what, Mom? What are you talking about?" Before I could intervene, Madame Dubois launched into an accusatory tirade. "Don't pretend, Sophie. I know all about it. How this man," she pointed at me dismissively, "has been taking advantage of you for years. How he's been living off you, letting you pay for everything while he does nothing all day." I felt my blood boil in my veins. How dare she? All those years of hard work, of sacrifice, reduced to nothing by her unfounded accusations. "Mrs. Dubois," I began, trying to keep my composure, "you're completely mistaken. I don't know where you got your information from, but—" "Silence," she yelled, cutting me off sharply. "I've had enough of your lies, Pierre. Sophie, darling, open your eyes. This man is a parasite. He doesn't deserve your love, he doesn't deserve to be part of our family." Sophie, still in shock, tried to intervene. "Mom, calm down, please. I don't understand what's going on, but I assure you Pierre isn't." But her mother wasn't listening. She continued her stream of accusations, each word hitting me like a stab. "He's lazy, Sophie. Have you ever seen this man work? No. While you're slaving away to pay for this luxury apartment, he's sitting here doing nothing. It's a disgrace, a real disgrace to our family." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to shout the truth. But I had promised myself to keep it a secret, not to overshadow Sophie's career. Yet, faced with these accusations, I felt my resolve waver. "And that's not all," Madame Dubois continued, approaching her daughter. "I've heard rumors, Sophie. Rumors about his nightlife, about the women he dates when you're not around. This time, it was too much. How dare you?" I exploded. "I never." "You don't have to say anything," she cut me off curtly. Then, turning back to Sophie, "My darling, I've come to save you. To get you out of this situation before it's too late. This man is no good for you. He's got to go, now." Sophie, with tears in her eyes, seemed lost between her mother and me. I could see the doubt in her eyes, and it broke my heart. How could she doubt me after all these years? "Pierre," she said softly, is it true? Everything Mama says?" I felt my world crumble. How had it come to this? How had mere rumors and misunderstandings destroyed the trust we'd built? "Sophie, my love," I said, my voice trembling, "you know me. You know I'd never—" But Madame Dubois didn't let me finish. She physically interposed herself between Sophie and me, as if to protect her daughter. "Enough lies. Sophie, this apartment belongs to our family. Your father and I bought it for you, not for that imposter. It's time for him to go. Now." I looked around in disbelief. This apartment I'd chosen so carefully, paid for every month. And now they wanted to kick me out. "You can't do that," I said, anger rising in me. "This apartment is as much mine as Sophie's. We're married, we've built our lives here together." Madame Dubois laughed contemptuously. "Built? You didn't build anything, Pierre. You just took advantage. Now get your things and get out of here before I call the police." I looked at Sophie, seeking her support, but she seemed paralyzed, unable to take sides. Her silence hurt me more than any of her mother's accusations. "Sophie," I whispered, "you don't really believe all that, do you? You know who I am, what we've been through together. She wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't know anymore, Pierre. It's all so sudden. Maybe you should go away for a few days, just until things calm down. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My own wife was asking me to leave. I felt a wave of nausea rise up inside me. Madame Dubois, triumphant, headed for our room. I'll help you pack, Pierre. The sooner you're gone, the better for everyone. I stood there, motionless, watching this woman enter our privacy, start rummaging through our things. Sophie, still silent, sat on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. Anger, sadness, and disbelief fought inside me. How could our lives have changed so quickly? How could these lies override years of love and trust? I approached Sophie, kneeling before her. My love, I said softly, look at me. You know me better than anyone. You know I'm not the man your mother describes. We've been through so much together. Don't let rumors destroy what we've built. She looked up at me, and I saw a mixture of doubt and love that tore at my heart. Pierre, I need time. To think, to understand. Please go away for a few days. For me. I felt something break inside me. My wife, my rock, was asking me to leave. To let these lies win, if only temporarily. Madame Dubois returned, suitcase in hand. Here, I've packed a few things. Now get out. I stood up slowly, the weight of the world on my shoulders. I looked around me, at the apartment I loved so much, at the life we'd built. And now I was being asked to give it all up based on mere rumors? As I reached for the suitcase, a wave of determination washed over me. No, I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let these lies destroy our lives. It was time to reveal the truth, whatever the consequences. I turned to Sophie and her mother, ready to tell them everything. The truth about my job, about the money, about everything I'd kept secret for so long. This was a moment of truth, a moment that would change everything. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all those years of secrecy weigh on my shoulders. The time had come to reveal everything, to put an end to this misunderstanding that threatened to destroy our lives. That's enough, I said in a firm voice, surprising both Sophie and her mother with my suddenly assured tone. It's time you knew the truth. Madame Dubois giggled, but I raised my hand to interrupt her before she could speak. Please let me finish. What I'm about to tell you will probably surprise you, but it's the plain truth. I turned to Sophie, her eyes filled with confusion and apprehension. My love, I'm sorry I've kept this from you for so long. The truth is, I'm the one paying the €6,000 rent on this luxury apartment. A stony silence fell over the room. I could almost hear the cogs turning in their heads as they tried to make sense of what I'd just said. What? Stammered Sophie, her eyes widening in shock. Madame Dubois, for her part, burst into mocking laughter. Come on, Pierre. You don't expect us to believe this nonsense, do you? You, paying €6,000 rent? With what money? I took another deep breath. With the money I make from my online business. A business I've built up and grown in great secrecy over the last few years. I walked over to our office and pulled out my laptop. With a few clicks, I opened my company's bank statements, sales figures, and customer contracts. It was all there in black and white. See for yourself, I said, turning the screen toward them. Every month, I earn far more than this rent. I have an international clientele, contracts with major companies. All this money I've kept secret not out of shame or malice, but for a very specific reason. I turned to Sophie, taking her hands in mine. My love, I know how important your career is to you. I've watched you work so hard to climb the ladder, to make a name for yourself in your field. I didn't want my success to overshadow yours. I wanted you to shine your own light, without the shadow of my financial success. Tears were beginning to roll down Sophie's cheeks. But, why? Why didn't you tell me? I gently caressed his cheek. Because I love you. Because I wanted you to succeed on your own, to have the pride to say that it was you who accomplished all this. I didn't want people to think you'd succeeded because of your husband's money. Madame Dubois, who had remained silent until now, approached the computer. Her eyes frantically scanned the numbers on the screen, her face shifting from disbelief to amazement. "But, how?" she murmured. "How could you hide all this?" I sighed, turning to her. "It wasn't easy, Mrs. Dubois. Every day, I had to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I worked at night, when Sophie was asleep. I took calls in the park, pretending to go for a walk. I even rented a small office in town for days when I absolutely had to meet customers in person." Sophie shook her head, visibly upset. "But all those times I thought you were at home doing nothing." "I was working," I completed softly. "On my phone, on my tablet. Every free moment was an opportunity to advance my business." I walked over to our bookcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Here are all the official documents for my company. The articles of association, the tax returns, everything. I did everything by the book, but with the utmost secrecy." Madame Dubois took the file with a trembling hand, leafing through it with wide eyes. "But why? Why didn't you tell us? Why did you put up with my accusations?" I looked her straight in the eye. Because Sophie's success was more important to me than my own recognition. "I'd rather be seen as an unambitious husband than risk overshadowing your daughter's achievements." Sophie collapsed onto the sofa, visibly overwhelmed by all these revelations. "I just can't believe it. All these years. I thought it was me who kept us going, who allowed us to have this lifestyle." I sat down beside her, taking her hands in mine. "You keep us going, my love. Not financially, perhaps, but through your love, your support, your presence. Without you, all that money would be meaningless." Madame Dubois sat down heavily in an armchair, the backrest still in her hands. Her face was a mixture of confusion, shame and disbelief. I don't know what to say. All those horrible things I said." I turned to her. "Mrs. Dubois, I understand your reaction. You thought you were protecting your daughter. But I hope you now understand that my love for Sophie is real and deep. I've sacrificed my gratitude, I've accepted being frowned upon, all for her happiness." A heavy silence settled over the room. Everyone seemed lost in thought, trying to assimilate this unexpected revelation. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "But now, what do we do? How are we going to handle this?" I squeezed her hand gently. "It's up to you, my love. If you want us to go public, I'll do it. If you'd prefer us to keep it a secret, I'll continue to work in the shadows. All I care about is your happiness and success." Madame Dubois rose slowly, approaching us. Her face was now flushed with remorse. "Pierre, I don't know how to apologize for my behavior. I've been unfair, cruel even. I judged you without knowing the whole story." I nodded, accepting his silent apology. "The important thing is that we now know the truth. We can move forward, together, as a family." Sophie snuggles up to me, tears running freely down her cheeks. "I love you so much, Pierre. I can't believe all you've done for me, all the sacrifices you've made." I kissed him tenderly on the forehead. "I would do it again without hesitation. You are my life, Sophie. Your happiness is all that matters to me." As we stood there, entwined on the sofa, with Madame Dubois looking on with a contrite expression, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. The truth had finally been revealed, and even if I didn't know exactly what the future held in store for us, I was relieved not to have to carry the secret any longer. The road to reconciliation and mutual understanding might be a long one, but at least we could now travel it together, without secrets or misunderstandings. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. You could hear a pin drop in our living room, once so warm, now charged with conflicting emotions. Sophie, my beloved wife, remained huddled against me, her tears gently wetting my shirt. Madame Dubois, meanwhile, seemed frozen in place, her face going through a whole range of emotions: shock, disbelief, shame, and finally, a semblance of understanding. It was she who finally broke the silence, her voice barely louder than a whisper. I don't know what to say, Pierre. All these years, all these accusations." I raised my hand, gently interrupting her. "Mrs. Dubois, I understand your reaction. I really do. You thought you were protecting your daughter, and that's to your credit. But deep inside, I felt a dull anger rising. An anger I'd suppressed for years, silently accepting his disapproving looks, his acerbic comments, his hasty judgments. It was time to get it off my chest, to say what was on my mind. However, I continued, my voice firming, I can't ignore the harm your actions and words have caused. Not just today, but for years. Sophie looked up at me, surprised by my tone. I gently caressed her cheek, silently assuring her that all would be well, before turning back to her mother. Mrs. Dubois, for years you've judged me without trying to really know me. You assumed the worst about me, without ever asking yourself if your assumptions were well-founded. Do you have any idea what it's like to feel constantly judged, constantly denigrated by the mother of the woman you love? My voice trembled slightly, years of frustration rising to the surface. Every family dinner was an ordeal. Every visit a source of anxiety. I endured your remarks, your looks, your thinly veiled contempt. And all for what? Because you decided, without any proof, that I wasn't good enough for your daughter. Madame Dubois lowered her eyes, visibly uncomfortable. Pierre, No, please, let me finish, I interrupted firmly. I've kept silent for too long. Today you crossed a line. You came into our home and tried to drive me out. You tried to destroy my marriage based on rumors and assumptions. Do you have any idea how much harm you could have caused if I hadn't revealed the truth? I felt Sophie squeeze my hand, silently encouraging me to continue. I love your daughter more than anything in the world, Mrs. Dubois. Every decision I've made, every sacrifice I've made, has been for her. For her happiness, for her success. And despite all that, you never hesitated to judge me, to put me down, to make me feel I wasn't up to the job. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I ask you now to think. Think about your actions, your words. Think about the impact they've had, not just on me, but on Sophie, on our marriage. Do you really think this was the best way to act for your daughter's happiness? Madame Dubois seemed to shrink in her chair, the weight of my words visibly crushing her. She opened her mouth several times, as if to speak, but no sound came out. Sophie, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. Mom, she said softly, Pierre is right. Your behavior towards him has always been a source of tension between us. I often had to defend him, reassure him after your visits. Do you have any idea of the stress this has put on our relationship? I saw Madame Dubois's eyes fill with tears. I thought I was acting for your own good, Sophie. I just wanted to make sure you were happy, safe. But you never really listened to me, Sophie replied, her voice tinged with sadness. Every time I told you how happy Pierre made me, you found a way to criticize him, to question his intentions. You never tried to really get to know him. I put an arm around Sophie's shoulders, grateful for her support. Mrs. Dubois, I said, softening my tone slightly, I'm not saying all this to make you feel guilty. I want you to understand. I want you to realize the impact of your actions. And above all, I want us to be able to move forward, for the good of all. A heavy silence settled over the room again. Madame Dubois seemed lost in thought, her face reflecting deep introspection. Finally, she looked up at us, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she murmured. Pierre, Sophie, I didn't realize. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was. She rose slowly, approaching us hesitantly. Pierre, I know my apology won't be enough to erase years of inappropriate behavior. But I want you to know that I deeply regret my actions. I was blinded by my own prejudices, my own fears. I nodded, acknowledging his sincerity. The important thing is that we can move forward from here. Together, as a family. Sophie stood up, taking her mother in her arms. Mama, I love you. But I also love Pierre. He's my husband, my partner, my support. I need you to accept him, to respect him. Madame Dubois nodded, hugging her daughter tightly. I promise to try, darling. I promise to do better. I rose in turn, joining their embrace. It was a moment of vulnerability, of truth, a moment that would mark a turning point in our family relationship. As we parted, I realized that this confrontation, difficult as it had been necessary. It had paved the way for mutual understanding, for a chance to rebuild on sounder foundations. How about a cup of coffee? I suggested, sensing that we all needed a moment to digest what had just happened. We could talk, get to know each other really well. Sophie smiled, grateful. That's an excellent idea, my love. Madame Dubois nodded shyly. I'd like that very much, Pierre. I'd really like to get to know you. As I headed to the kitchen to make coffee, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road to reconciliation might be long, but we had taken the first step. And for the first time in a long time, I had hope for a truly harmonious family relationship. The sweet aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the apartment, creating a warmer, more soothing atmosphere. I returned to the living room, carrying a tray with 3 steaming cups and some of Sophie's beloved cookies. The mood was still tense, but you could feel a subtle change in the air, as if a new chapter were opening before us. Madame Dubois was sitting in the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, looking thoughtful and a little uncomfortable. Sophie had moved to the sofa, leaving a place for me beside her. I distributed the cups and sat down, taking my wife's hand in mine. There was silence, disturbed only by the clinking of spoons against china. It was Madame Dubois who, to my surprise, broke the silence. Pierre, she began, her voice trembling but determined, I don't know where to begin. My apology seems so insignificant in the face of all the harm I've caused. I looked up from my mug, meeting his gaze. For the first time, I saw a vulnerability I'd never noticed before. I acted out of fear, she continued, tears in her eyes. Fear of losing my daughter, fear of her being unhappy, fear of no longer having my place in her life. But in doing so, I almost destroyed what made her truly happy. Sophie squeezed my hand, her thumb gently caressing the back of my hand in support. Mrs. Dubois, I replied gently, I understand your fear. A mother's love is powerful, and you wanted to protect Sophie. But you must understand that my love for her is just as strong, just as sincere. She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I see it now, Pierre. I see the sacrifices you've made, the love you have for my daughter. I've been blind for so long. Sophie intervened, her voice soft but firm. Mom, I always tried to tell you how happy Pierre made me. Why didn't you ever listen to me? Madame Dubois lowered her eyes in shame. Oh, my darling. I was so sure I knew what was best for you. I guess I was afraid I wasn't needed in your life anymore. Seeing how happy you were with Pierre made me feel useless. I was surprised by this revelation. I'd never imagined that Madame Dubois's coldness towards me actually concealed such insecurity. You've never been useless, I said, surprised by my own sincerity. Sophie always needed you, your love, your support. And so did I, in a way. I wish I had your blessing, your confidence. Madame Dubois's eyes widened in surprise. Really? Even after everything I've done? I nodded. You're the mother of the woman I love. You're part of our family. I always hoped that one day we could have a real relationship. Sophie stood up suddenly, approaching her mother. She knelt before her, taking her hands in hers. Mom, I love you. You will always be my mother, always important in my life. But Pierre is my husband, my partner. I need both of you in my life, but in different ways. Do you understand? Madame Dubois nodded, tears flowing freely now. I understand, my darling. I'm so sorry I tried to come between you. I can see now how much you love each other, how good you are together. I stood up in turn, approaching them. Mrs. Dubois, what would you say to starting afresh? Getting to know each other better, without prejudice or ulterior motives. She looked up at me, a mixture of hope and apprehension in her eyes. I'd love to, Pierre. But, how can you forgive me so easily? I smile softly. It's not easy, and it will take time. But I believe in family, in love. And I know that's what Sophie would want too. Sophie stood up, embracing us both. This is exactly what I want. My family, united, loving each other despite differences and past mistakes. We stayed like that for a while, in the family embrace that seemed to seal our new beginning. When we finally parted, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The tension had given way to a sense of hope, of new possibilities. How about another cup of coffee? I suggested. This time we could talk, really talk. I'd like to tell you how I started my business, the challenges I faced. Madame Dubois smiled, a real smile this time, the first I'd seen directed at me. I'd love that, Pierre. And maybe you could call me Elizabeth. Madame Dubois seems so formal now. I felt my heart warm at these words. With pleasure, Elizabeth. As I made my way to the kitchen to prepare another pot of coffee, I heard Sophie and her mother start chatting softly behind me. Their voices were tender, loving, without the tension that usually characterized them. As I made coffee, I reflected on the incredible day we'd just had. What had started as a nightmare had turned into an opportunity for healing, for mutual understanding. Of course, not everything had been resolved. It would take time, patience, and effort on all sides to rebuild what had been broken and to create something new and beautiful. But for the first time since I'd married Sophie, I felt we had a real chance to be a united family. Secrets had been revealed, misunderstandings cleared up. We could now move forward together, with honesty and love. When I returned to the living room with the fresh coffee, I found Sophie and Elizabeth laughing together, sharing an old family photo Elizabeth had taken out of her bag. They looked up as I approached, inviting me to join them with a smile. I sat beside them, listening to their stories, sharing my own. And as night fell softly over Paris, our apartment filled with laughter, tears at times, but above all with love and hope for the future. A day that had begun in pain and confusion ended in understanding and reconciliation. It was only the beginning of a long road, but we were ready to travel it together, as a family.